Hi there, my name is Olivia Sowie, and this presentation is about the Anti-Filipino Watsonville Riots of January 1930. This presentation was originally created in spring of 2010. This presentation includes a brief overview of Filipino immigration, a history of Filipinos in Watsonville, themes and context of the Anti-Filipino Watsonville Riots, a timeline, further information, bibliography, and acknowledgements. First, a brief overview of Filipino immigration. In 1898, during the Spanish-American War, the United States helps the Philippine Islands gain independence from Spain. However, from 1899 to 1902, the United States seeks to maintain control of the Philippines, and the Filipinos fight back during the Philippine-American War. 1898 to 1946 was a period of American colonialism in the Philippines. The Philippines is the only colonial endeavor ever taken by the United States. The U.S. colonizes through benevolent assimilation, controlling the Philippine government, military, education, politics, and the economy. In 1903, the first Filipino immigrants came to the United States seeking higher education as a result of the Pensionado Act. The United States government wanted to educate these Filipinos so they could put them in the government of the Philippines and work within the bureaucracy. Between 1910 and 1938, almost 14,000 Filipinos had enrolled in educational institutions throughout the United States. From 1907 through the 1930s, Filipinos came to work on the plantations of Hawaii and canneries of Alaska. From the 1900s to 1965, Filipinos began arriving on the mainland. Most Filipinos coming to the United States at this time were young, single, working-class men. Many aimed to go to school and return home, but most had to work instead in order to survive. Many decided to settle in the United States. Most were never able to go back to the Philippines. During the 1930s, Filipinos held many types of jobs. In Hawaii, they worked in sugarcane and pineapple fields. In Alaska, Seattle, and California, Filipinos would work in the canneries. In California and other locations on the mainland, they would work as farm laborers. During the summer, Filipinos would usually work in the canneries, and the rest of the time they would be migrant workers, moving from region to region to follow the crops. Filipinos would also work in other service industry jobs as busboys, bellboys, cooks, dishwashers, domestic help, gardeners, and general laborers. Many Filipinos during this time would also serve in the United States military as merchant marines, Navy sailors, and Army soldiers. And now a history of Filipinos in Watsonville. Chinese and Japanese laborers were restricted access into the United States as a result of the Immigration Act of 1924. As a result, Filipinos were recruited to fill their agricultural and service labor positions. Filipinos replaced other ethnic workers in the United States alongside Koreans and Sikhs. The position Mexican migrant workers are in during the present time are similar to what the Filipinos experienced in the 1930s. Because of this status, just like today, Filipinos were subject to the same prejudices and persecutions as the ethnic workers before them. This map shows where Watsonville is located in relation to the rest of California. After the gold rush of 1848, settlers began arriving in the Pajaro Valley to obtain land with the gold they had found and to raise crops for California's exploding population. Immigrants, such as descendants of Ohlonese, Californios, Northern and Southern Europeans, Chinese, Japanese, Filipinos, African Americans, and others, arrived to work as growers and harvesters for the increasingly diverse crops. The Pajaro Valley moved from livestock ranching to growing grains and potatoes to orchards and eventually to a multitude of row crops. In 1871, growth in the Pajaro Valley flourishes when the Southern Pacific Railroad links the area to the Santa Clara Valley. Agriculture and food processing becomes, and still remains, the mainstay of the Pajaro Valley economic structure. Here is a map showing important locations in Watsonville circa 1930. Palm Beach is the location of the dance hall where the anti-Filipino Watsonville riots first began. To the east, Storm Ranch, also known as Murphy Ranch, is the location of the shooting of Fermin Tobera. The Oriental Cafe, which was known as Nino JT Restaurant in 1930, and the Streamline Pool Hall were on Main Street in Watsonville. In the 1930s, the 100 block of Main Street consisted of many different stores and establishments owned by Chinese and Japanese proprietors. Farm workers most likely frequented these places. Here is a list of more Filipino or Asian-owned businesses and locations of recreation on the 100 block of Main Street in Watsonville, circa 1930. In order to fully understand the anti-Filipino Watsonville riots, it can be helpful to be aware of the historical themes and context within which they occurred. See if you can relate these themes and context to current times. Thematically, there was hostility to Filipino laborers who worked cheaply under poor conditions. There were myths concerning Filipino social, sexual, and health habits, and a fear that Filipinos would integrate into society. Furthermore, politicians used anti-Filipino sentiment to gain voter support. During this era, Filipino workers were willing to work for extremely low wages. Americans believed that Filipinos were taking jobs from deserving citizens. Many Americans were concerned with Filipino behavior. They saw them as violent because of the use of bolo knives during the Philippine-American War. They saw Filipinos as sexual because most of the Filipino population at the time were men because of the workforce. Since there were not many Filipino women, Filipinos sought relationships with white women. Many Americans were concerned with the existence of taxi dance halls where Filipino laborers would enjoy their free time. These Filipinos would dress up in their best clothes and buy tickets to dance with white women to live music. The expression $1 a day, a dime a dance came from these taxi dance halls since every dance cost these men a dime. Many workers spent a lot of their money at these taxi dance halls, earning around $1 a day, dancing mainly with white women. Because of this, many Americans were concerned with the interracial contact. And now, a timeline of events. The Watsonville riot was actually just one event in a chain of anti-Filipino incidents beginning in the mid-1920s. In August 1926, Filipino youths were harassed when trying to attend a local street dance in San Joaquin Valley. This became known as the Dinuba Street Dance Incident. The American Legion Vigilante Brigade was formed to patrol their streets since the community believed that white and Filipino youth socialization was an unhealthy phenomenon. This incident catalyzed Senator Johnson and Congressman Welch to exploit the issue to alert Californians to the danger of Filipino labor. On New Year's Eve in 1926, the first anti-Filipino attacks occur at a pool hall in Stockton, California. From 1927 to 1928, riots occur in Kashmir and the Yakima Valley in Washington state. In 1929, the Commonwealth Club of California joins with the American Legion, California State Federation of Labor, and the California Joint Immigration Committee to plead for increased restrictions on Filipino farm labor. On October 24, 1929, in Exeter, California, a fight breaks out as Filipinos were shot with rubber bands as they escorted white girls at a street carnival. These are the first anti-Filipino riots in California. On October 30, 1929, the Watsonville Evening Pajaronian headlines with, "The Filipino is the state's next problem." From December 3rd to 4th, 1929, 25-year-old Filipino Perfecto Bandalan is arrested from a hotel room in the presence of 11-year-old Bertha and his fiancée, 16-year-old Esther Schmick. Mrs. Schmick told authorities that charges were brought because Esther's father, Alex Schmick, wanted $500 from Perfecto to marry Esther. On December 5th, 1929, Bandalan and Schmick's engagement photo and an announcement of a Filipino taxi dance hall opening in Palm Beach in the newspaper begins to instigate anti-miscegenation and anti-Filipino sentiment in Watsonville. On December 6, 1929, Judge D.W. Rohrbach proposes that the Northern Monterey County Chamber of Commerce adopt a resolution condemning the local Filipino population. It passes without a dissenting vote. Rohrbach states that through his research, he has found that unsanitary living conditions among the Filipinos has led them to be meningitis disease carriers. On December 10, 1929, Adrian Catevos is held on suspicion of firing the shot that injured George Cruz in a fight over a woman on Saturday night in front of Foresters Hall. As a result, 8 Filipinos are held for questioning. On this same date, in an article entitled "Filipino Starts Rough House," Antonio Supaev is in medical care after being struck over the head with a stick in Salinas, California's Chinatown district. On January 10, 1930, the Watsonville Evening Pajaronian runs a lengthy Judge D.W. Rohrbach interview condemning the Filipinos by dwelling on social and sexual fears. A quote from Judge D.W. Rohrbach. With the arrival of every boatload of Filipinos, a boatload of American men and women are thrown out of the labor markets to lives of crime, indolence, and poverty because, for a wage that a white man cannot exist on, the Filipinos would take the job and, through the clannish, low-standard mode of housing and feeding practiced among them, will soon be well-clothed and strutting about like a peacock and endeavoring to attract the eyes of the young American and Mexican girls. The Northern Monterey County Chamber of Commerce then passes a series of anti-Filipino resolutions. The Palm Beach Dance Hall opens on January 11, 1930. Local citizens complain about white women frequenting the club. The women were being employed as entertainers and waitresses, and many were imported from the South. A quote from a Watsonville resident: "Taxi dance halls where white girls dance with Orientals may be all right in San Francisco or Los Angeles, but not in our community. We won't stand for anything of the kind." On January 16, 1930, Prefecto Bandalan is formally charged with contributing to delinquency of a minor, 16-year-old Esther Schmick. Schmick's father was arrested upon appearing at the courthouse to attend the hearing due to neglect charges. On January 18, 1930, the Watsonville Evening Pajaronian headlines, "State organizations will fight Filipino influx into county." Bands of young roving vigilantes are ignited into 5 days of rioting. The Welch Act is introduced, which would classify Filipinos as aliens ineligible to citizenship and inhibiting them from entering the country due to the 1924 Exclusion Act. Hawaiian sugar interests oppose this bill, but their sentiment is not shared by the Hawaiian populace. The anti-Filipino Watsonville riots occurred from Sunday, January 19 to Thursday, January 23, 1930. Angry mobs numbering from 200 to 700 people roamed the streets of Watsonville. 2 Filipino boys were injured after the Palm Beach Taxi Dance Hall was raided on Tuesday, January 21st. Shots were fired upon the crowd and owner, Mr. Locke Padden. The mob then turned to local ranchers who employed Filipinos. On Wednesday the 22nd, 46 Filipinos were beaten and chased down the street, eventually taking refuge in the city council room. The now 700-person mob traveled down San Juan Road, attacking Filipinos indiscriminately. Most of the damage on San Juan Road was done to the Frank R. Ribera, a labor contractor's camp, where 22 Filipinos were swept from their dwellings. A car of 8 young men approached a Filipino bunkhouse at the John Murphy Ranch. They opened fire, and 22-year-old Fermin Tobera, also known as Herman Sermin Tejera, was shot through the heart. As a result of the negative publicity from Fermin Tobera's death, white citizens formed a law and order group to prevent further vigilantism. On January 21, 1930, a white raiding party opens fire on a bunkhouse full of 6 Japanese field workers at McGowan Ranch, mistakenly hunting for Filipino laborers. Luckily, no one is injured. Only 2 Japanese laborers were in the bunkhouse, which was reported to occupy the ringleaders of the Filipinos. On January 22, 1930, Alternating Currents runs an article reprimanding the white community on their bad behavior during the rioting. They urge for political activism to encourage independence of the Philippines and also freedom for any white entertainer girls being kept at the taxi dance halls. In the aftermath of the anti-Filipino Watsonville riots and death of Fermin Tobera, Filipino leader A. Antonor Cruz calls a meeting of the Monterey Bay Filipino Club in Palm Beach, host of the dance hall, passing a resolution condemning businessmen and politicians for inciting anti-Filipino sentiment. Filipino leader A.E. Magsuchi points out that Rohrabacht's statement that he would send those unwelcome little brown men back to the Philippines was the apex of ethnic insensitivity. The reason for only 1 death and 5 days of rioting was due to Filipino support of the local police forces, who dispersed mobs when they could. This was backlash from the negative publicity due to the Exeter incident. Anger results from the investigation of Tobera's death, as there was no identification of who fired the fatal shot. On January 23, 1930, the Watsonville Evening Pajaronian runs an editorial chastising the white community for their actions during the rioting and calls for an increased police presence to disperse any attempts at group gatherings in the streets. On January 24, 1930, a contingent from the Los Angeles Filipino Citizens League arrives in Watsonville to promote peace and tranquility. They are hostilely met by Watsonville citizens, destroying any efforts at peacemaking. However, the instatement of white volunteer deputies means no rioting occurred that evening. On January 25, 1930, Congressman Free is scheduled to take the floor to discuss the Watsonville riots. His proposed sentiments were as follows. The alleged slaughter of a Filipino in a riot between union laborers in the Filipino colony was in reality the forceful expression of a community craving to rid itself of vice dens run by Filipino colonists. The Filipinos of Watsonville are of the very lowest type. I am going to show that the so-called rioters, even though they acted without the law, were solely tried by the vicious tactics of the Filipinos in luring white girls into degradation. On January 27, 1930, officials sweep through Gilroy and remove all Filipinos and unemployed men and women, hoping to prevent riots similar to Watsonville when it is rumored that the dance hall girls of Palm Beach are Gilroy locals. Fermin Tobera's body is taken home to Salinas to be sent overseas to the Philippines for burial. On January 28, 1930, the anti-Filipino riots begin to spread to surrounding areas. 2 Filipinos were arrested in San Francisco, having been jailed the night before during the first San Francisco race riot for disturbing the peace. In San Jose, 20-year-old Leonard Brissett is held on an open charge from the authorities that he is advocating a campaign of terrorism to drive the Filipinos from Santa Clara and Monterey counties. Brissett's plan was to dynamite Filipino homes and gathering places. Brissett is also held for questioning as a suspect in the Alfred Johnson stabbing case. An anonymous woman professes to know the identity of Fermin Tobera's killer. She calls Leo Escalante, president of the San Jose Filipino Club, inquiring about a reward for the capture of Tobera's killer. On January 29, 1930, race riots spread to San Benito County, where several men invade Hollister hunting for Filipinos. They were run out of town by the local authorities. Black powder is used to detonate a portion of a Filipino club in Stockton. However, none of the occupants were seriously injured. On the same date, the California State Boxing Commission ruled that there would be no more boxing matches between whites and Filipinos until the disturbances end. On February 5, 1930, the preliminary hearing for the 8 youths charged with rioting and responsible for Fermin Tobera's death begins. They testified that they had gone to the Storm Ranch to tell the workmen to dress and leave the bunkhouse and that they would take them to Watsonville City Hall as protection against the whites. Filipino witnesses testified that the youths broke down the door to the bunkhouse and ordered the workers into the waiting automobiles. It was determined after 5 hours in court that the boys were present on the ranch and a door was broken down. On February 6, 1930, the Philippine Emergency Association is formed to prevent Filipinos from participating in any further race riots with whites. It was agreed that Filipinos should cooperate with authorities by avoiding conspicuous places where they would mingle with whites. They also supported the interracial boxing ban. On February 8, 1930, the case against the 8 youths that assaulted Tobera's bunkhouse starts to dissolve due to insufficient evidence. The youths continue to purport that they were there to escort the Filipinos to City Hall. More racial incidents occur beginning on February 13, 1930. Japanese farmers won't hire Filipino labor and Filipinos won't buy from Japanese merchants due to a boycott in Stockton. This was linked to an aborted marriage between Saiki Stapia, who started the boycott, and his Japanese fiancé, whose father intervened in the match. In Sacramento, Wang Sung, a Chinese cook, is jailed for shooting and killing Jose Espinoza, a Mexican section hand. On February 14, 1930, a taxi dancehall brawl breaks out in Honolulu between 8 Filipinos and 2 soldiers over the attentions paid to the dancers by the islanders. The soldiers were injured and the Filipinos fled the scene and were later arrested. On February 17, 1930, 6 of the 8 youths in the Tobera shooting plead guilty and would be sentenced on February 21st. Fred Majors and George Barnes, who continued to plead not guilty, were set for a jury trial that same day. On February 25, 1930, the 8 youths are sentenced to 2 years in the county jail, 4 of which were immediately released on probation, including Fred Majors and George Barnes. The remaining 4 are set to serve 30 days in jail before being considered for probation. This is a photo of the Palm Beach Dance Hall, the initial site of the Watsonville riots. It was owned by the Lock Padden family. A trolley connected downtown Watsonville to the beach, making it easily accessible. The road to the beach is now called West Beach Street. For years after the riots, Filipino communities still held picnics and events at Palm Beach. The area has now been redeveloped. The original site of the dance hall is now the location of Palm Beach State Park and the Pajaro Dunes Resort. When I first worked on this project in spring of 2010, I interviewed local historian Jess Tabasa. He works very hard to preserve the history of Filipino-Americans and was an officer of the Monterey Bay Region branch of the Filipino-American National Historical Society, also known as FONS. Born in 1940, Jess Tabasa is part of the Bridge generation whose parents were immigrant and migrant laborers. A longtime resident of Watsonville, his mother owned a Filipino restaurant, the Oriental Cafe on Main Street from the mid-1930s to the mid-1980s. His mother was interviewed many times for insights into the history of Watsonville and of Filipino Americans. As a child, Jess Tabasa remembers hearing stories of the Watsonville riots and playing near the ruins of the old dance hall. I thank him now as I did back in 2010. I would not have been able to do this project without him.